Well, good day there. This is Joe Van Cleve, and welcome to another episode of the Typewriter video series. Today I'm going to talk about practicing typing. You know, we don't really think about the necessity of having to practice with a computer keyboard in order to be able to reliably enter characters in the computer. You just hit the keys and they work. And pretty much the same is true with electric typewriters. I know that when I took typing class in high school in the early 1970s, we had Underwoods and IBM electrics, and the whole point of the class was really about teaching touch typing and how to write business letters and form letters and stuff. But as far as using manual typewriters and us being collectors of manual typewriters, there's more to it than that. Just being able to reliably and repeatedly make good imprints on the paper takes some bit of practice. So stay tuned. Can you believe we're already at episode 48 of the Typewriter video series? You know, I didn't think that we would get to this far in the Typewriter series when I first started it early this year, but here we are. This subject matter of practice typing came to my mind yesterday after posting part 1 of the new Abacus series. And I was thinking about abacuses as a hobby, which obviously if you've seen that video you know that I'm fairly enthused about that subject as well. But in terms of abacus as a hobby, they require a lot more practice than a typewriter in order to do basic things like addition and subtraction. You have to put some time into it to get proficient at it. You don't think about that when you are operating a computer. I mean, besides the usual complexities of operating software that you might not understand, but just operating a computer keyboard, there's nothing to it. You hit the key, you push the little square buttons down, and you have a character on the screen. And as I said in the intro, the same is pretty much true with an electric typewriter. They just don't require any special skill or technique to get a normal impression, because it's electric, and the impression, the force of the impression, the velocity of the keys is all taken care of it for you by the electric mechanism. But a manual typewriter is different, and not only is a manual typewriter different, but every brand and model of manual typewriter has a different feel that requires you to spend a certain time of practice learning it, and even two samples of the same model might have a slightly different feel one to another. So there is a learning curve with manual typewriters over electrics or computer keyboards. So here is an example of a computer keyboard. This happens to be a Cherry MX Brown mechanical switch 60-key keyboard. But this is the typical keyboard, reminiscent of a lot of the keyboards from computer keyboards from the 1980s and 90s. But you know, every one of these keys you hit, it produces a very reliable keystroke indication on the computer device. These are great keyboards. No special technique or training or practice required unless touch typing and speed typing is your bailiwick. But for basic usage, two-fingered hunt and peck, no training required, right? We've kind of gotten a little bit backwards in a sense with these devices because they're capacitive, and sometimes, and with the tiny size of the keys, somebody with big clumsy fingers and thumbs like myself, we've actually gone backwards, I think, in some ways with keyboarding with the mobile devices over wonderful devices like this. But what about this? No special technique required, huh? Even with an electric typewriter, even with this old thing, this Smith Corona Coronet Automatic 12, you just press those little keys and it snaps to attention and you have a perfect imprint every time. So no real practice of technique required to get a good impression with electric typewriters, computer keyboards. Slightly less so, I think, with mobile devices because the screens are capacitive. They don't always work well, especially if you were doing things like wearing gloves or whatever. And the keyboards are quite small. But for the purposes of our discussion today, talking about manual typewriters, there's a technique involved. But even a typewriter, a manual typewriter, as nice as this Facet 1620, for instance, takes a certain technique in order to master the art of good imprints. If you hit it real lightly, as you well know being a typewriter user, then you aren't going to get as good of an imprint. Here's the electric Smith Corona. Here is where I was using pretty good technique on the manual facet. And here is where I was just hitting the keys real lightly, not paying much attention to how I was hitting them. And you can see, obviously, there's a big difference in the quality of imprint, a big variability in the imprint of the typewriter, just based upon my technique. Obviously, I'm preaching to the choir for anybody who is a user or familiar with manual typewriters. So what are we going to do? What do you do to stay practice in the skill of using a manual typewriter? There are a number of things that we can do, but they all amount to this. You have to spend enough time with each of your machines, whichever one it is, to become familiar with the kind of technique required to make the machine operate reliably. And for anyone who has a number of typewriters in their collection, who cycles them through use periodically, you know that some machines require just a different kind of an action than others. Not every typewriter in your collection is going to be 100% mechanically reliable all the time. And one of the most common problems with manual typewriters happens to be the escapement mechanism, which is that mechanism deep inside the machine that controls the spacing of the characters every time you type a character or a space. And in this regard, typewriters are somewhat like musical instruments, I think, in the sense that there's a certain amount of timing required, just like with playing a score. There's a time you have to keep. There is a certain technique required, so the escapement triggers at the proper time reliably and in rhythm with the letters, so that you have a continuous, smooth action. And I would also use the other analogy here that the art of staying practiced with manual typing is a lot like the art of staying practiced with a musical instrument. And I would even go so far as to say that we should consider, we being manual typewriter users, aficionados, and collectors, we should stay familiar enough with our machines to have some kind of a discipline around practice. Just like a musician, a pianist or whatever, a guitarist, spends a periodic time in his life. You've made some kind of a schedule around the art of practicing music in order to stay proficient. I think we have to do the same thing with manual typing. What are some of the things that we can do to stay practiced? Well, obviously, you could just pound out random letters on paper, right? Gobbledygook. But that is kind of a waste of ink and paper and a waste of our time. I think what is better would be to type actual prose or poetry, actually do some real writing. Think about it. It's one thing to take a musical instrument and just to pound out random keys and chords, for instance, to stay practiced at the action of the instrument, but that's not the same thing as playing a score of music. And the same thing I think is true with using a typewriter. The purpose of a typewriter is obviously to write with, not just to make impressions of letters in ink on paper. So this comes to the idea of, obviously we should be writing. We should be doing some kind of writing. And I think the most obvious answer to this, and most everybody that uses a manual typewriter already knows this, but I think the first place you can start is journaling with your typewriter. That is to say, it doesn't have to be necessarily daily in that kind of regular periodicity, although that would be nice. But you should spend time with your typewriter just writing out your thoughts. You could have a journal of your daily activities, your daily thoughts. You could be writing about certain subject matter that interests you. You could, and I've referred to this previously on other episodes of this series, you could be doing what I call stream of consciousness writing. And stream of consciousness writing, to me, is a real powerful way of spurring on your creativity, because you start off with no a particular preconceived agenda of what you're going to be writing about. But you just sit down at the keyboard, put your hands on the keys, and start putting thoughts to paper. And you'll be surprised at what you find is the result of that. And you'll find one thought leads to another, which leads to another. And because you don't have an agenda set ahead of time, you're free to let those thoughts carry on to some unknown conclusion. You're free to let it flower and blossom into something else entirely unexpected, which is a great, great thing. This spurs our creativity as writers. So I'm suggesting that the idea of practice typing isn't just for the mechanics of keyboarding, but it's more for the idea that typewriters are instruments for writing with. And so as keyboardists on manual typewriters, we really need to be thinking not only about the mechanics of it and staying in practice to keep our fingers in tune to the action of the machine, but it's more about learning to write with a manual typewriter. How the rhythm of the machine, you have a line of type and you have thoughts flowing and you're putting those words down to paper as fast as you can, and then all of a sudden you come to a stop, maybe in the middle of a sentence. You don't know where that sentence goes. You don't know how to end it. You're in the middle of a fork in the road in your thinking process. How am I going to continue with this thought process? Where does this lead? You stop in the middle of your sentence, and then all of a sudden, oh, I get it, a couple more words, then, oh, okay, then you go, and then all of a sudden the carriage return, and you carriage return, you put a couple more words, and then you have to stop again, and again, put more words down, and this process continues in starts and stops. Sometimes it's a continuous, violently fast stream of words that you can't even type fast enough to get down. Other times it's a very halting process, a few words, a few sentences, sitting there thinking, all of a sudden another inspiration, more words, more sentences, another paragraph. This is the writing process, and it's about being able to use manual typewriters as writers. And when I use the word writer, I'm not necessarily limiting that word to the common definition of a person who writes professionally, but the idea that all of us people can write, and it has nothing to do with how successful you are in a career of writing, but it is the fact that we all can become literate, adept, and be able to put words down on paper that interest ourselves and perhaps, if we're lucky, interest other people as well. One interesting thing that I've noticed in being a collector and user of a number of typewriters is that not every typewriter in my collection spurs my creativity the same. And I think that I am drawn to portables, and especially ultra portables. And it's funny that I would be, because usually portables and ultra portables are not the best typing machines in terms of touch and feel, and often don't have as many features as full-featured machines. I think for me, I like to have a variety of writing environments. I like to be able to move my typewriter between my office, my patio room, my den, my man cave shed, my patio, or even take the typewriter out somewhere like the patio of a cafe or coffee shop somewhere. I like to write in various places. I don't necessarily get inspired by sitting in the same place looking at the same four walls. Maybe I'm not really a good writer. Maybe it's the external stimulation that's more important to me. I don't know. But I find myself gravitating toward using portables more than bigger machines. And so you'll find, if you're like me, that not every portable is a good machine to write a lot of words with. And I found for myself, and you probably know this from seeing earlier videos, one of the machines that really inspires me to do a lot of writing is the Smith Corona Silence brands of typewriters. Silent or Silent Supers, that line of typewriters, the 5 series, I think they call them, from the mid-50s, early 50s. But those typewriters, they're just big enough to have a little bit better feel and touch than ultra portables, but they're not too big. They have a really good snappy action, and the keys, the linkages are tight, and the carriage return levers are very ergonomic and nicely positioned. And I find, for some reason, especially with an Elite font type, the smaller size font, I find I can just throw down a lot of words on paper. And also, for some reason, one of my Smith Coronas, it's the Silent Super, is a little bit more of what I call a beater typewriter than the silent one that I have that's a little nicer condition. I got the Silent Super from a Craigslist ad. A gentleman living in a rental house, almost stereotypically maybe kind of like a hippie kind of a person. A really kind of a dirty, filthy apartment, kitchen grease and all this stuff and all kinds of clutter and all this, but really interesting fella, fun to talk with. And I came away realizing that this filthy, dirty machine I just bought had gone through quite an experience on its own. It had some kind of a background of character to it. And I've always kind of felt that that machine had a little bit extra character than the other one, even though it didn't quite operate quite as nicely as the other one. It had a few nagging escapement issues. But it became my beater typer. I could type rough draft stuff, not anything that I necessarily want to put on my blog because of all the corrections or skips or overstrikes and all that. But just for stream of consciousness, private writing, I found that machine works really well. Spurs on my creativity. Another machine in my collection that I really enjoy using is the little blue brother-made Webster Xl 747. It has a slightly more hard, stiffer touch to the keys. It's a carriage shift instead of a basket shift or segment shift. So the touch of it requires a little bit more finger force, but it's lighter, smaller, sleeker, bluer, more colorful. It has that cool feature of the repeat spacer, and it's certainly a lot easier to carry around. That's another type of machine that just inspires me to write. So what I'm saying here and what I'm suggesting is, if you're a typewriter collector, if you have more than one machine, you'll probably find there are some machines that you just naturally gravitate toward and you just naturally write better on than other machines. And I would encourage you to use those machines to practice your art of writing. But at the same time, if you want to be able to use all of your machines or most of them in your collection as practical tools, you're going to also have to do a rotation schedule. I rotate my machines maybe a month or so at a time. It's not a real rigid schedule. I keep using the same machine. I have it out on my tray table here, and I keep using it over and over until I just start getting a hankering for another machine, and then I'll bring out another one, and I'll use it over and over for weeks or a month or so until I decide, okay, it's time to get another one out. But every time I switch machines, I find, oh, this machine has a little issue. I forgot. You have to be a little snappier on the keys here, or it does this sometimes. So you have to kind of relearn how the machines work. Every one of them is a little different. Sometimes it's helpful to take a little note card and type up your impressions of the peculiarities and quirks of each machine, and then keep that in the machine in its case when it's being stored. So the next time you bring it out of storage, you have that little reminder, hey, remember this one? This thing sometimes skips when it's near the left side of the page, or you need to hit it with a little bit more force, or you need to be a little bit more slow and predictable on the space bar, or whatever it is. But it helps you to relearn the touch of each machine by making those notes to yourself. So I know this was kind of a rambling, talkative episode of the Typewriter video series, but I just want to just bring to your attention the idea that typewriters, manual typewriters, are very much like musical instruments, and we have to learn to play them in order to get adept at them. They require skill and practice, like musical instruments. They're unlike computer keyboards and electric typewriters and even cell phones. So I encourage you, get those machines out on a regular basis and write something. Diary, journal, blog, poetry, random stuff. Write a letter to a friend or relative, but keep writing, keep using those machines, okay? Okay, until next time, this is Joe Van Cleve, and you have yourselves a great day.